Hi, this is section 2.2, and it's about histograms, frequency polygons, and ogives, which are three kinds of graphs that you can use to show what's going on with a grouped frequency distribution. If you remember in the last section, we talked about how to take a whole bunch of individual numbers and group them together into classes, and then the frequency for each class would be how many of those numbers, how many of those data values are between the lower and upper limits of that class, or between the lower and upper boundaries before they got rounded to the nearest whole number. So let's say you've got one of those grouped frequency distributions representing how many of those individual data values fall into different classes, and you want to show visually how your data is distributed. These are three different graphs that you could draw to show that. Histograms, which is a kind of bar graph, frequency polygons, and then ogives, which show cumulative frequencies. So let's take these one at a time. Here is an example of a histogram. Now, this particular histogram is based on one of the examples we were looking at in the last section. The one about the sample of people at the store and how much they spent. So here we divided the data up into these 8 classes, and the frequencies told us how many of those individual dollar values fell into each one of the classes. There were 11 that were somewhere from $1 to $15. There were 12 of them that were somewhere from $16 to $30, and so on. So here's the histogram that represents that graphically. Notice there are 8 bars. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. One for each of the classes. And I have labeled the boundaries between the bars. So the first bar is everything between 0.5 and 15.5. So that represents the dollar amounts that were between $0.5 and $15.5. The second bar is everything between 15.5 and 30.5, and so on. And then the height of each bar corresponds to the frequency of that class. The first class with boundaries 0.5 to 15.5 had a frequency of 11. So that first bar goes up to a height of 11. The second bar goes up to 12. The third one goes up to 6, and so on. And 12 is twice as high as 6. So you can look at this and see right away that there were twice as many data values that were between 15.5 and 30.5 as there were between 30.5 and 45.5. So here's how you draw a histogram. You can get a computer to draw one for you, but it's nice to do at least one yourself on paper so you know exactly what's going on and you know what the computer is doing when the computer draws a histogram, or what to look for when you're looking at a histogram that somebody else drew. So first you would draw and label the axes. On the horizontal axis, you label that with the class boundaries, equally spaced. Remember, the classes are all supposed to be the same width, so there should be the same amount of space between the first boundary and the next, and that boundary and the next one, and that boundary and the next one, and so on. So if you were doing this on graph paper, you could make each one of these bars like 2 squares wide, or 3 squares wide, or however many squares looks good. But they should both be the same number of squares on the graph paper. And then the vertical axis running up the side of the graph should be labeled with the frequencies. That should start with 0 at the bottom. So right down here at the bottom, we're starting at 0. If one of the classes actually had a frequency of 0, then it wouldn't go up at all. And then go up to high enough to get the highest frequency in. In this example, the highest frequency of any of the classes was 12, so we need to have enough room to go all the way up to 12 here. And we need to use a consistent scale. That means there should be the same amount of space, same number of lines or squares on the graph paper, going from 0 to 1 as there is from 1 to 2, and 2 to 3, and 3 to 4, and so on. Then once you've drawn and labeled the axes, then you want to draw in the vertical bars, one for each class. The height of the bar should be the frequency of that class, and there shouldn't be any spaces between the bars. They should be right up next to one another because there aren't supposed to be any gaps between the classes. The upper boundary of one class is right where the lower boundary of the next class is. So immediately when one class ends, the next class begins. So let's try doing this ourselves, drawing a histogram for the frequency distribution that we came up with in the last section for how long various patients had to wait at the veterinarian's office before they got in to see the vet. So this is what we came up with in the last section. We got this frequency distribution with these 6 classes, and these were the frequencies of the classes. And when we draw the histogram, we're going to need to look at the boundaries and the frequencies. That's what we will use to draw the histogram. So we start out by drawing the horizontal axis running across the bottom of the graph, and we label it with the class boundaries. So here's 0.5, then I went 3 squares over and put 5.5 here on this line. I went 3 more squares over and put 10.5 here, 3 more squares over and put 15.5, then 20.5, then 25.5, and then 30.5. So there are the boundaries. Now we need to draw the vertical axis running up the side of the graph and label it with the frequency. So 0 would be right here at the bottom where the horizontal axis is. And then we'll just go up 1 square for each frequency number. So 1 square up, we get to 1. Another square up, we get to 2. Go up another square, we get to 3, 4, 5, 6. And I've got numbers going all the way up to 17, but really we only need to make sure we have enough room to go all the way up to 13, because that's the highest frequency. So the tallest bar, the one for this class, is going to go up to a height of 13. Now we're ready to start drawing in the bars. So that first bar goes from 0.5 to 5.5. And it goes up to a height of 7. So it would look like this. You don't have to color it in, you just have to draw a bar. You can color it in if you want, but you need to draw a bar that stretches from the lower to the upper boundary horizontally, and then from the bottom, the horizontal axis, up to a height of 7, because that's the frequency. That's how far up it goes vertically. And then we do the same thing for each of the other classes. So in all, we're going to have 6 bars. And it looks like this. Here's the bar for the first class, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth. Notice the 2 7s are the same height as each other, and they're more than twice as tall as the 3, which is 3 times as tall as the 1, and so on. And then we probably really should label these axes, like say what these numbers represent. So on the horizontal axis, these are the boundaries and they represent dollar amounts. And on the vertical axis, these numbers represent the frequencies. So that's a histogram. I'm going to stop this video here and then come back in part 2 and talk about the next kind of graph, which is a frequency polygon. See you then.